I'm Sandy Cohn. I'm the field director at the School of Social Work, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you. I would like at this time to introduce Audrey Kahn. Audrey is the field coordinator for the part-time program.
Good morning and welcome. It's so great to see so many of you here today. As Sandy said, my name's Audrey Kahn. I'm the field coordinator for the part-time MSW program for both the Eau Claire site and the Madison site. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Tracy Schreffer. She's the Associate Director of the School of Social Work, and she's also the Director of the part-time MSW program, and she'd like to say a few words on behalf of the school this morning.
Good morning, y'all. Everybody good today? So I know it's early in the morning, and I'm going to keep this very brief, but I just have two things that I would like to do. The first is to welcome everybody to this event, and I really want to thank everyone. I think that until I became director of the part-time MSW program, I really didn't know a lot about field. I'll be honest, because I wasn't a field instructor. I was teaching classes. I was proud of our field program, but I really didn't know that much about it. I've learned a lot about it in the past 3 years and how much work it is to be an agency supervisor and how important y'all are to our students. Students talk about you long after they've graduated and the impact that you have. And you do this out of the goodness of your heart when I know that everybody is swamped, because we all know with budget cuts, and there you have it, enough said there. So I just want to truly thank you. And I wish that we could do more of these things. But that comes to my second point, and that is that Sandy Cohn has been our field director since 2007. She is also a graduate of our program. She graduated in 1985. Sandy has given her, I hate to say resignation, because really this is about retirement. She will be retiring from the school July 15th. And this will be her last agency supervisor workshop. And I just want to recognize some of the things that Sandy has done for us over the years, because her job is big. Sometimes it's probably thankless when we argue with her, and challenging. But she really has done so much for the school in such a short time. And I think just looking around today, this is evidence, because she has quadrupled the numbers of people attending this workshop just since 2007. And she has really fought for agency supervisors to be recognized for the work they do. She's created the ethics. She has the ethics and boundaries workshop. She tries to offer one a year so that, again, agency supervisors have a chance to get their CEUs. And that's been a big thing. She also tries to think of and comes up with other ways for people in the community to earn their CEUs. And I think, we can't do a lot as a school. Social work, always the poor department on campus. But, I think that Sandy tries to think of ways to thank y'all. The other thing that she has done is in terms of the students in the school is she's really worked on enhancing our evaluation system, and that's important because we really do pay close attention to our evaluations. We read them and we make changes. And so it's important to hear from agency supervisors, from field instructors, from the students, to hear how things are going so that we can continue to improve the program to meet everybody's needs. And then the other thing is the YWCA, the Racial Justice Summit. With Sandy, we have become very involved with the summit every year, and that's given opportunities for our students, for field units to go to the summit, to attend, for the school to have a presence there. And I think that's such an important partnership, and she has created other partnerships. That's just one example. And now I'll put my part-time program director hat on. So I've been director. The program's been around for 3 years. We're going into our 4th year. And prior to these, the last 3 years, there was a 5-year planning committee. 5 years they met to create the program. And Sandy was on that committee. and she was the voice of field education for the program. And so we are very, very grateful to her. We feel the program is going really well, and we're grateful for all that she contributed in her planning. So that is what I wanted to say, and we want to just give her, it's a small gift, but we just want to thank her for everything. You have to stand up. I just want to say, Sandy, you will be missed. And this last year, there'll be a lot of last, but I hope that, like everybody else that leaves the School of Social Work, nobody ever truly leaves. People just keep coming back and coming back and coming back. So we hope that you'll come visit us and be a part of the school in other ways. And so now, on to the day, and I hope y'all have a great day. I have to go back to school for student meetings, but I will be back after lunch for a presentation. So have a really great morning. Thank you. Audrey?
It's a very dangerous stage, so we're trying to be careful up here. So thank you so much, Tracy. It's my pleasure this morning to be able to introduce Dr. Sowbel, our keynote speaker for today's workshop. Dr. Sowbel is the field director at Hood College in Maryland. In your folder is her bibliography and information. If there's more information about her you'd like to know, just feel free to look at that. Dr. Sowbel has 17 years experience as an agency supervisor and has conducted research on issues related to field education. We've asked that any questions that you have during her presentation, you ask towards the end of the presentation so there's enough time to get through all of the content. We do sincerely thank you, Dr. Sowbel, for spending time with us today and to discuss the important role that we as educational partners play in gatekeeping and the evaluation process. So welcome.
I am by nature a clinical social worker, has worked in the mental health field, and I still work with clients. And I have been a field director for 12 years, but I was an agency supervisor for 17 years. And my heart has always been with field. I am passionate about field, so I'm very gratified, if not a little overwhelmed, to see so many people here today. And it's so important that we have these dialogues about field. I want to thank you. I know you got thank yous from everybody who's come up here so far, but having been an agency supervisor and now having been a field director, I know that the field part of our program is actually not just a small aspect, not a non-academic part of the program. It is the heart of our training. And we really couldn't teach students to be social workers without you. So, and I appreciate particularly how much work it can sometimes be, although also very rewarding. So I want to say that even though I've been in this area of work for a long time and have done some research in this area, I'm not presenting myself as the all-time total expert on this subject. I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions, and I do pride myself on having come up with a lot of questions about gatekeeping. In my 17 years as an agency supervisor, like most of you, there are two things to know about that. One is that all the time that I was an agency supervisor, I never failed a student. And at that time, criteria for dismissal was even more vague than it is now. So we did, like most of you, most students, almost all the students were either good or great, and then occasionally we had a few students that we might, give us pause. So as a professor, I have failed students in the field and in the classroom. But when I was an agency supervisor, I never did, and that's something I've thought about a lot, why I never did. and whether there were a few people who got through that I really was a little concerned about. One in particular, who it never occurred to me really to fail, because that person was conscientious. She was bright, a hard worker, always came on time, was a good documenter, better writer than some of my students now. And you know, she took feedback. She seemed to be really passionate about social justice. And so that, as far as I was concerned at the time, and certainly the school, dismissal was never something I ever considered. But when I thought about her, there were a number of red flags that had come by me at the time. One was that she came on her first day with holey jeans and a low-cut shirt to the program. But when I had staff complain to me and I talked with her about our dress code, she was able to modify that and changed her dress, never came like that to the program again. She seemed like she had, as we were doing the background check, she came to speak to me to tell me that a number of charges might come up on her background check. Yeah, that was my first time even dealing with things. And you know, these days people come up with DUIs or a drug charge from when they were a teenager or something like that. But these included several DUIs, but also some other charges. And so that gave me pause. And then she had some populations that she was perhaps a little biased about, a small population like, you know, men. And so, you know, but she talked about that herself, you know, her difficulty, and we talked about it in supervision, and she seemed to give lip service to working on that. And so that, in addition to the fact that she continued a mentoring friendship relationship with one of the clients after she left the program, were all things that, you know, gave me pause. But they certainly were never, and there were other populations she had some biases about that I didn't really learn about till after she was through. And that made me think about the idea that, you know, even though we really try to help people look at themselves and we try to work with them in supervision, that really there may be a lot of things that we never learn about the student while they're with us. And also there are some things that bother you about some students that, at least for me, was very hard to identify exactly what it was. Was it personality? Was it past history? Was it her ability to relate to all kinds of clients? What really was it that I was concerned about? So that led me to the idea of thinking about, you know, what constitutes suitability for our profession. And I have to say I have a bias that not everyone is suited for our profession. But the students that I'm talking about that I was concerned about, I just want to emphasize, these are very, very few students. These are not a lot of students. And we are not talking about, you know, screening out millions of students. What I had been sort of observing was that really we didn't really dismiss very many students at all. You know, there didn't seem to be a clear criteria for dismissing students. And I was, at that time, running a student program with an occupational therapist, and I did take note that their criteria for getting through the field placement was much, much more stringent than ours. And, you know, if they had someone who missed a few times coming to the placement on time, they were dismissed. And whereas we would be much more likely to kind of try and find out why and see if we could work with them. And, you know, after all, we're social workers. And so, so that also got me thinking about what exactly would constitute dismissal for us, and led me to do a dissertation when I decided to go back to school, rather in my more advanced years, much to the chagrin of many of my friends, on whether personality traits might affect the way students perform in the field. And I hope that an article will be forthcoming on that. So that gives you a little bit of background on how I came here. I do want to say that the title of my presentation reflects my belief that there are a number of barriers to effective gatekeeping in our profession, so that the question for those of us committed to quality social work education isn't so much, are we ambivalent, or why are we ambivalent, which I am going to speak to today, why we're ambivalent, But really, why shouldn't we be ambivalent? And okay, so I've been reminded I don't have to point that. I can just click it from here. I want to say that today I'm just going to talk about 5 factors that I think affect our gatekeeping and discuss potential ways that we might address those barriers. And I also want to talk a little bit about the themes that are interwoven with those barriers, the themes related to social work that contribute to the ambiguity in gatekeeping. Even though we have a lot of literature on gatekeeping, it's very fragmented and it's on all kinds of different topics. I can't really say we don't have any gatekeeping literature, but they're on lots of different things. More recently, we've started to have more attention to issues of termination and screening. So what exactly is gatekeeping? That may seem obvious to most of you, but for the purposes of our talk this morning, I'm just going to tell you the assumptions that I'm making, which is that gatekeeping is a process and an outcome. And the process entails an admissions protocol with GPA, people looking at students' GPAs, their transcripts, their essays, their references, and then ongoing assessment of the student in the classroom and in the field, screening out the students that are clearly unqualified and retaining those who are competent to practice within the guidelines of the Code of Ethics. But as an outcome, gatekeeping is defined as the professional obligation of social work educators to ensure that graduates are fit to practice by screening out unqualified students. And our profession has been previously and continues to be very confused and unclear and ambivalent, or maybe I should say conflicted, about what appropriate gatekeeping guidelines should be. So maybe you know that since the inception of the profession in the early 1900s, we've always thought of the field placement as an area where maybe we would evaluate students and make sure they're ready for practice, suited to this profession. And the Council on Social Work Education for a long time actually, has mandated that we have termination and gatekeeping mechanisms in our policies, although they haven't mandated what they should be. And so programs generally have different kinds of ideas about what that should be. And only 15 years ago, 70% of our programs, almost 70% of our graduate programs, really just used GPA and the Code of Ethics as our kind of threshold for dismissing students. Although students with difficulties represent a very small minority, you all know, those of you who have had any of those students, that they take a great deal of time and energy. And so estimates in the literature about professional programs indicate that probably you would expect to see about 10% counseled out or screened out of programs. But in social work, the small amount of literature that we have indicates that really we only screen out about 3 or 4%. And most of the time counsel out because we're a compassionate bunch. And so most of the time that leads to a lot of conversations and hopefully the students sort of coming to that decision themselves. But if we have a lot of students who aren't terminated once they're in the program, then we need to be vigilant about our admissions protocols and our screening up front so that we recognize if we have high numbers of people accepted, then we're probably going to have high graduation rates. And at least some of us don't think that, that social work should involve open enrollment to everyone. So this, I don't know, I don't think this will surprise you, that most programs expect that a primary location for screening and gatekeeping takes place in the field. And when you think about it, the agency supervisor is a volunteer professional educator who's very busy doing many, many things, coming to trainings, but they're frequently expected to be the primary person that's going to identify, confront, and address whatever problem behaviors or attitudes come up. And Sometimes programs, I know this isn't true of your program, but sometimes programs don't always inform or emphasize this to students or to agency supervisors. And so maybe that accounts for the fact that so few students are recommended for failure in the field. Let's see. Oh, but the other thing to know is that graduate social work faculty, medical faculty, counseling faculty, they all say that they see failing behaviors much more than they actually fail students, and that's just an observation. So the 5 factors that I've identified as relevant to gatekeeping are fear of lawsuits, enrollment pressures that the school has, difficulty defining suitability, some confusion in the agency supervisor role that's partially inherent and partially hasn't been attended to, and lack of clear evaluation measures in our profession, in our institutions. So litigation, that is the fear that a student might threaten a lawsuit or have an actual lawsuit, is the most powerful universal concern by field faculty when in terms of terminating students, and by far, excuse me, a lot of the literature on gatekeeping is on that topic. Even though the courts have shown a deference to the academic institution's decision-making processes and the faculty's judgment of what performance is inconsistent with professional conduct. So you might say, why would faculty be concerned about discrimination when it comes to, why, faculty is very worried that might we be discriminating against students, especially students under the protected class of mental disability. There's a worry that maybe are we discriminating along mental health lines? And how would we know if we were? And it's important to know that we don't look at people's diagnoses or people's past history, that what we have to look at is current behavior. And no one should ever be being failed out of a program because they have a diagnosis. In fact, if we, and maybe many of you know that in the literature on who goes into the helping professions, we have 65% of the people who themselves or people in their family have various issues like mental health and substance abuse and trauma and many, many other issues. And so that in itself is not at all a problem for us. In fact, we wouldn't have anybody in social work if we took out all those people. And, but it's true that, that's true for also nursing and the medical profession and the other psychology, the helping professions. So that is one thing that we do know, and we do know that we have a higher preponderance of people with, coming from dysfunctional families or various issues among social work students and among social work practitioners. That being said, for 95, 99% of the people, that's not a problem, and in fact, sometimes it's kind of a help. So I only mention it because that is the area that people get concerned about. They get nervous if they see problem behaviors and they are aware that the person might have a mental health diagnosis, that somehow, is it the diagnosis that's fueling their concern, or will they be perceived as discriminating against a student? So the thing that we have to do, the thing that we have to do to be aware of the American Disabilities Act and what it actually says, be familiar with it, be familiar with have legal consultation with our legal offices about the way we're handling our procedures on this issue, and then also to read some of the relevant literature on litigation in the area of professional education. And there's a bibliography in your packet, and one of the articles that I recommend there is the 2004 Wayne article, which covers professional education, not just social work, but professional programs and how the courts have basically addressed them. And that can help alleviate the apprehension that educators sometimes feel about this issue. We do need to have clear program criteria in our handbooks and in our field manuals that students see, not just that we have them, but students are aware of, and also agency supervisors are aware of. And so we also need to have this protocol clearly defined, and we have to have what's called due process. We need to make sure there's a clear paper trail, and we need to be sure that we've given students the opportunity to correct any deficiencies that we've identified. And we need to give the students, once it comes to the point where people are concerned, and we usually are talking about egregious kinds of things, that really dismissal is imminent, then we want to be sure that there is a forum and a process available to the students so they can have a chance to give their own perspective. And those things, in addition to open communication with your field instructors, agency supervisors, and students, tends to minimize this issue of lawsuits. Also, the courts consider unprofessional conduct and lack of psychological fitness to be part of an academic criteria for professional programs with overt standards of professional behavior. So, and at this point, courts also consider graduate professional education to be a privilege, not a constitutional right. So that's the first barrier, is litigation. It's the one that people worry about a lot. The next is enrollment pressure, and perhaps you might be aware that we've had, in the last 20 years, an increase of 120% in our graduate social work programs, according to accredited programs, according to the Council on Social Work Education. And there is some feeling that we had, in 1975, about 40% of the people applying to social work programs admitted, and that more recently, those numbers have been around 75%, although your program is very selective. But in many graduate social work programs, it's 80% or higher. But the most recent statistics have sort of indicated 75%. And actually, that means that there's sometimes some competition between the programs for students. Sometimes there's limitations of resources to only take so many students. And of course, the economic climate, such as we're in today, influences how many people are applying. So we actually have a little more selectivity going on now because we have lots and lots of applications, more applications than usual for a lot of the large graduate programs. So enrollment pressure, pressure to maintain enrollment and maybe even increase enrollment, is also a factor sometimes in gatekeeping. This is the factor that perhaps you might be most familiar with. And as an agency supervisor, I never really thought about this. I thought about it a lot after I was an agency supervisor, that conflict between the desire to work with students from a strengths perspective and be a non-judgmental mentor to students can be in conflict with the need to prevent people who may harm clients from entering the profession, that those are two different mandates, and that our code of ethics, although not necessarily legally binding in all states, is requires us to prioritize the well-being of clients above all else. So we, as agency supervisors, struggle with where our loyalty lies. Does it lie with the client? Does it lie with the student? Does it lie with our agency, our educational institution, or our profession? And I'm sure most of you are aware that it's hard enough to serve two different masters, if you will, let alone 4 or 5 or 6. So it's natural that we are sometimes confused, or we're working all day as clinicians, and then we have to sort of switch our role into sort of an educator who's evaluating people, and sometimes that doesn't happen that naturally. So we also have to be aware that students are going through a developmental process, and sometimes it's hard for us, watching the trajectory of how people do in field placements, to distinguish whether what we're seeing is the natural anxiety and self-consciousness of being new, or being maybe a little immature or being a little inexperienced versus actual lack of capacity to do some of the things required in social work. So that can be a hard thing to distinguish. And we always, being good social workers, err on the side of caution there and give the students the benefit of the doubt. This is just their first year. I'm sure they're going to be better next year. I'm sure they're going to be better second semester. If I could just work with them, we could probably solve these issues. But it is incumbent on programs to provide clear guidelines to their agency supervisors, and I know you're in a program that does, both in terms of their evaluation and their handbook on what they expect of students, what the practice behaviors are that are required, and then and they are also, in my opinion, it's sort of expected of them to really support and give extra time and energy to agency supervisors who might be having a difficult student, who might be considering recommending a failure, because there can be a lot of psychological costs to dealing with a troubled student. A lot of agency supervisors have said that they're not willing to deal with the emotional consequences, or the field faculty. In your case, maybe this would involve your field instructors, because of the emotional drain that it takes. And they've mentioned things like, well, maybe the school's not going to support me, or maybe the school is just going to transfer them to another place anyway, so they might as well work with me. Sometimes they're not sure about exactly what to document, or if I don't want to recommend failure, what alternatives are there? And they certainly don't want to be, and I certainly didn't want to be, responsible for dissuading a student or affecting their career path. There is a lot of discomfort about that, and avoidance of like an appeals process that might take place if the student grieved the failure. And then, as you might imagine, agency supervisors and field instructors are concerned that we not have unequal treatment, that we have a clear, consistent protocol that we use with everybody. So we want to make sure that, well, if we're recommending failure for this student, would we recommend a failure for any student based on this criteria? So I had a long-term field instructor once who said to me, I get paid by my agency, but I don't get paid enough to fail a student. And as you know, that as agency supervisors, most of the time we don't get paid for that role. So that's something we take on that can be very rewarding and very time-consuming if you have a difficult student. Okay. Oh, I do want to say that before we get to the fourth barrier, because we've talked about litigation, enrollment pressure, and confusion in our role sometimes, that suitability often involves several different areas, one of which everyone agrees, the one that everyone agrees to is ethics. And that there has been some indication that there's been an increase in malpractice claims in our profession. So it is important that we look at ethics, but it's also important to know that with all that agency supervisors do, although they might certainly address overt, egregious behavior of a student, that they don't always have time to sit around and reflect on the more subtle ethical issues that might come up. And so it's very important that the school and the agencies work together when they have questions about that, have dialogue about that, to kind of, the more people that talk about it, the more helpful it is. So at this point, before I talk about suitability, what I'd like you to do in your packet, there is something I've included that says directions for the vignette rating activity. And there are 3 vignettes of students included in this little handout. And what I'd like you to do is use the rating system on the front. So look and see if you think these vignettes constitute someone who is clearly exceptional, which would be a 1, ready for practice would be a 2, and clearly on the cusp, may or may not be ready would be a 3, needs more training would be a 4, and 5 would be unsuited. And you have that on you don't have to write that down, you have that on the page. And then these 3 vignettes come from a longer measure developed in Canada by Marian Bago and her colleagues. And I just would like you to take a minute to read through them and give a rating to these 3 vignettes. Tried to pick out the short ones, but Let me just ask you for the first vignette, the mental health vignette. Let's see, I'm not, would somebody be willing to say what they rated that vignette? Somebody? Anybody? Oh, good. You rated it as a 2 and a 2? So some people rated it as a 2. Did anybody rate it as anything else? A 1. And any other ratings for this one? How many people rated it as a 2? How many people rated it as a 1? Okay. All right, let me ask you about the, I'm going to tell you what the people who rated it as in a minute. Well, let me ask you about the second one, the child welfare vignette. What did you rate that? At 3? Somebody said a 3. Any other ratings for that? A 4. Any other ratings for that? How many people rated it a 3? How many people rated it a 4? Okay, almost like kind of even there. Okay, and the hospital vignette, 4. And how many people rated it a 4? Okay, and what other rating was it? A 5. And how many people rated it a 5? What? In between, a 4.5. Some people, how many people rated it a 4.5? Okay, so first let me just say that this is part of a longer vignette matching evaluation that has been used in Canada, where they have 20 vignettes, and these vignettes ratings were developed by agency supervisors who came to qualitative, focus groups and kind of, argued with each other and came up with ratings. So the first one, so this is not necessarily right or wrong, but this is the rating system that they came up with. The mental health one they rated as a 2, and the child welfare they rated as a 3, and the hospital they rated as a 4. I specifically didn't give you the unsuited vignettes because they seemed very obvious in a way, and same with the exceptional. But I gave you these vignettes because I wanted to make the point that reasonable people can disagree, and that there is no absolute on this, and that there's a lot of subjectivity in evaluating. And so it's not even that clear to us sometimes whether is this a student who's kind of on the cusp, or is this a student who really needs a lot more training. And I do like the ratings that they used in the Canadian measure, and I think they've shortened that or are using some other measures. Just so you know, Canada has a lot of literature about this, and they are kind of a little ahead of us on looking at some of these issues. So I've already mentioned ethical concerns. A second area of suitability, so those vignettes represent one way of evaluating suitability. The competency-based evaluation that you have, where you're looking at different practice behaviors, is another way to evaluate suitability. The code of ethics is a third way of evaluating, and that is actually the one way that everyone agrees we should consider. That is something we are in agreement about. So emotional stability, aside from ethical concerns, emotional stability is the second area that comes up the most often in the literature as something of a concern for suitability. Not a diagnosis, not mental health per se, but stability, whatever that is. So is emotional stability related to people's ability, their interpersonal relationships, their emotional intelligence, their attachment issues from early in life? Or is emotional stability related to their personality traits, their, ethical issues, their behaviors? Is it related to past experiences? We don't really know, but we do know that people who work in social work need to have a high relational ability, an ability to relate to lots of different clients who have a wide range of needs, and they have to have some resources accessible for clients. So we do know that. And in terms of the mental health piece, what we find is that, as I said before, mental health diagnoses or issues, or depression or anxiety in itself, are not at all problematic, but what is problematic is active symptoms that interfere with the emotional resource to deal with clients, or the ability to learn about social work. So as long as people are aware of what their various idiosyncrasies are and addressing it, it's usually not an issue. And of course, we in the educational, in the classroom, try to make students very aware that those are things that need to be addressed. So how emotionally healthy a person needs to be to practice, and how exactly one might make that appraisal, is a bit more complicated. And we really have generally found it difficult to totally define and assess, certainly consistently, among programs. But I mention it because some research has shown that the students who were rated unsuited for the profession disproportionately came up with emotional instability. So the third category, which is kind of our catch-all category, and maybe they should all be called performance problems, includes missing time, being overextended, being late. And these days we have a lot of students who are working, have children, and are trying to do full-time education and full-time work and work in the field. So this is a category that sometimes has some overlapping kinds of issues, like boundaries might belong under ethics. And we might have students who don't have self-awareness, or what my friend Peggy calls people who are impervious to feedback from their agency supervisors. We might have people who don't have a commitment to the profession, don't seem that motivated. So this can be characterized as many different things. But one thing that's continued to be consistent is that we have a little bit of difficulty identifying or defining exactly what suitability is. But these are the three areas that have come up the most in the literature over the last probably 20 years. So there are different perspectives for looking at suitability, and there is a screening in perspective and a screening out perspective. And screening out is the simplest to explain, so I'll say that just in a sentence. It entails stopping a student at any point on the training continuum if standards aren't met, or upon admissions if resources are limited. So that one's pretty easy, and in case you haven't figured it out, I personally have the belief that screening out is not only a perspective, but a responsibility for our profession. Screening in, though, might speak to you somewhat, because the screening in position implies that students who will be nurtured through the field process, regardless of any red flags, with the awareness that all students have potential, we work from a strengths perspective, and that we, if we do our job right, should be able to bring that student to a minimum level of competence by the time they are ready to graduate. And the idea is that that screening in is much more, resonates much more with a person and environment perspective that we have, and ensures that there won't be any discrimination. And there has been some concern that there might be discrimination towards people who are different, the LGBTQ population, people of color, people who have abuse in their background, anybody who's dealing with some kind of internalized stigma issue, that maybe if their behavior is at all different, that maybe we might somehow screen them out. And I just want to say to that social workers are disproportionately people who are self-aware and evaluate and want our students to graduate and want our students to do well, and that we consult and evaluate ourselves, probably much more than other professions. And not only is there no evidence that diverse individuals would be disproportionately screened out, there's no evidence that we screen out very many people at all. we don't screen that many people out. So, so I want to say that, but that concern is well placed. We do always want to be thinking about, are we discriminating? And so that is not necessarily a bad thing, but is something that we're always thinking about. So the screening in position purports that if a particular student is unsuited, the degree to which they're unsuited is the degree to which that program did not individualize their training sufficiently. So that's the idea. I think I mentioned that. So there's much more you could say about suitability, because the more elusive the construct, the more we could debate it. But there has been some improvement, in my opinion, both in the area of defining suitability and but particularly in the area of the performance measurement, since I originally wrote my articles and talked about this. But there has been agreement that there's difficulty in measuring performance, and most of the measures that we've used, almost all the measures that we've used, do not have known validity or reliability, so we have no idea if they're actually measuring what we want them to measure, but still we have to use something, right? And that's our same attitude is about research, you know. Sometimes it's very hard to do perfect research for so many reasons, but we have to do some research anyway, because we'd rather have some way of looking at things from an evidence-based perspective than none. So, so it's difficult to measure, and as I said before, the one thing we agree on is the NASW code, but keep in mind that the NASW code is not legally binding in most states. Most states have their own code of ethics, and sometimes they might say our code of ethics is the NASW code of ethics, but our code of ethics is quite broad, and then, but at least it includes a number of areas, but generally the state code of ethics is shorter, so it's even broader. So it gives you some general guidelines. It's not really going to help you specifically with some particular issue, but it is good that that's something we've identified that we all agree on. And then because we had no good measures, the Council on Social Work Education kind of moved in this direction of competency-based outcomes, which we all kind of resist initially. But the idea was that let's more specifically define the practice behaviors that we're wanting to see. Let's not just say the student's good in assessment. Let's just actually say, you know, what it is we want to see. And that actually has been helpful. To help us be more specific about what it is we're expecting. And the more specific we are, the easier it is for us to be able to tell whether it's actually happening. Just like you want your students to have behavioral measurement in their learning contract, we want to be more specific in evaluating what behavioral, what are we using for behavioral measures, and that we can actually tell whether they've happened or not. So we want to give students some vague notion of what they're supposed to be doing, and then say, well, we can't fail them because we don't really know what we meant, and we don't really know if they did it, and maybe they didn't understand what we were wanting. And so these practice behaviors are a good start. But in fact, agency supervisors, by and large, have said that there's something beyond competency-based practice behaviors that we're looking for. In fact, we care more about the personal attributes, or what we call metacompetencies, the process abilities of the student, than we do whether they have all those competencies. So I can take a student who doesn't have assessment skills or doesn't have great documentation skills, and I can probably teach them to do that. But I can't teach them to be emotionally mature, to be good with clients, to think on their feet and be a critical thinker. I can't teach them to take initiative on their will. Maybe I can. I might be able to encourage them to take initiative on their own. But there are some things that are innate to the student that in some ways matter much more according to agency supervisors. Not that they don't want students to have competencies, but if they don't have these personal attributes, flexibility, the ability to communicate with not just the supervisor, but other people in the agency, a motivation and some insight, the ability to have insight. And of course, emotional intelligence is kind of relational ability is kind of a thing for me, partially based on my personality research. And so agency supervisors have said by far the most important thing, the most important of those meta competencies that we want our student to have is trustworthiness and also the ability to reflect on themselves, self-reflection to resolve issues. So if the client gives them feedback, they're able to not take that personally, but to self-reflect and kind of look at their own behavior and then change it. And that's probably something you all do all the time. Maybe you don't think about it, but it's probably something innate to your work. So that's so far what we've been able to identify, but those meta competencies are not incorporated into any of our general measures that we use for evaluation for most programs. So we kind of have to say, are the grades the most important thing? And some research has shown that GPA, how the student does in the classroom, is correlated to how they do in the field. Some people think that classroom behaviors and values of the NASW code might be the most important thing. We know that competency-based outcomes are important, and the question is, where do these meta-competencies come in? So, of course, I and some of my colleagues think that we need some kind of either several different measures of things, or we need some measure that incorporates both the competencies and meta-competencies into our evaluation. And there are some new things coming up, and we should use all the measurement tools at our disposal. And there was a period where we thought maybe the problem was that scales themselves, that agency supervisors didn't seem to want to use numbers, numerical rating systems to figure out how good their student was, and thus the vignette measure was born. And when I used that vignette measure in my dissertation, the agency supervisors didn't know what rating those vignettes were. They just picked a vignette and said they matched it to their student. So they would say, Jane Doe, vignette K. And then I knew what that rating was according to that measure. There's a student suitability scale that one researcher has come up with. I don't know if they're actually using it in a program. And there's something called the objective structured clinical exam, which is something that some programs use in the classroom where they have a simulated role play with the student, maybe doing an assessment of some particular kind of client who's played by an actor, and they observe the student. So it's a different kind of measure because it's an observational measure. It takes a lot of time and energy, especially if you have a lot of students in your classroom. And so that's a barrier, but it is something that people have thought that students who are participating in this role play, and then they have to write a paper later on it, reflecting and analyzing what they did in the role play, that the combination of those two things might cover both some of the competencies and meta-competencies. So besides those 5 barriers, remember litigation, enrollment pressure, confusion in our role, suitability, and evaluation measures, there are some themes that were kind of woven into the barriers. One was strengths perspective. We have these values that are intrinsic to our profession, and non-discrimination came up a lot in trying to make sure that we don't discriminate. Social justice was one of our concerns, and self-determination. And those are not a bad thing. Those are the values intrinsic to social work. But the question is, are they at odds with discriminating about which students should go on in social work, which students are best suited to work with clients? Is being discriminating, so to speak, in any way ever okay? Not discriminating against a person, but discriminating, or maybe I prefer the word discerning, a student's readiness to practice versus a student's non-readiness to practice. is that ever okay? And are we always skirting that slippery slope of maybe discriminating towards a student for some reason? And at the same time, students have become, and I'm sure you're aware of this, much more demanding about their social work training experience. They view access to a social work degree as an entitlement, and they view themselves as consumers of social work institutions with a fiduciary obligation to prepare them. They're as paying students for the field. In other words, they're paying to come to school, so it's our job to make sure at the end they're a social worker and that they can work in social work. But some practitioners have said that the process of excluding the student from social work represents a kind of withholding of service and represents a limitation to applicants' rights to self-determination. The student wants to be a social worker, but that we have to recognize that that desire to enter the profession doesn't always translate into an entitlement or appropriate fit. But we do have to struggle with that in terms of our social work ethos. So, given that these particular barriers and given that these barriers are so complicated and much more nuanced than we might have originally thought, well, why should we struggle with the complexities of gatekeeping and spend so much energy in talking about it when really we're talking about a very occasional student that needs to be stopped at the gate, very occasional? Well, my answer is that we have 697 accredited BSW and MSW programs in the United States at this moment, and if we only had one unsuited person graduate from each of those programs a year, then in 10 years we'd have almost 7,000 unsuited social workers that we might unleash on our public. So we do have to look at even those small numbers of people that we worry about. So what do we have to do about these areas of ambiguity? Well, we need to resolve them in some ways. And few faculty members would find the emotional or financial cost of doing business acceptable in terms of lawsuits or threats of lawsuits, but we still cannot compromise our professional integrity to avoid those discomforts. And we have to stress that we have dialogue going on, that we make sure due process is happening, that we seek consultation and talk to each other. Because the reality of screening out unsuited candidates, we really have to face it squarely and courageously, even though certainly for me, and I would suspect for most people, it's inherently uncomfortable. We need to be sure that the programs are disseminating suggestions and expectations and support to promote dialogue, to deconstruct the ambiguity that is inherent in some of the things that we're doing. So this role has some inherent complications to it. And we have to, once programs have figured out what their own philosophies are around screening in or screening out and meta-competencies and bottom lines of suitability, we have to make sure that we are implementing reasonable gatekeeping procedures and clear parameters related to suitability. And we need to give each other the benefit of the doubt about the issue of discrimination. I think that we all, by and large, the majority of people want students to succeed, would give the benefit of a doubt to a student who is borderline, and we would give students every opportunity to correct their deficiencies. But at the same time, we do have to perform that same level of self-audit that we expect of our students. And so that is a difficult audit to perform sometimes or to debate about. But still, we have to do it, and we have to continue to participate in research to clearly define and better measure this complicated construct of suitability. So those are areas we have to still work on. And remember, I said that I'm really good at the questions, and so I'm going to leave you with the final questions that I think are relevant to us from this presentation, and that is that can we become more comfortable, can we as social workers become more comfortable as educators, and maybe all of you are, but trust me when I say there's plenty of people who aren't, that can we become more comfortable as educators with a gatekeeping function rather than just educator clinicians dealing with student clients? And then, you know, along with that, strengths perspective doesn't mean that we're not critical thinkers or that we're enabling people or that we want to avoid, we do want to avoid unpleasant challenges, but that we try to strive not to avoid that. In all of social work arenas, there will be most certainly imperfect processes, and they will be facilitated by imperfect field faculty in imperfect systems, both educational and agency. But still, we have to develop some procedures that maximize fairness to students while also at the same time protecting clients. And we can just assume that's going to be difficult at times. And in the end, no matter how much knowledge we have, no matter how fair and effective our due process procedures are, we will still not eliminate all ambiguity. Reasonable people can disagree. And we will still not be able to, you know, find a quick fix to the inherent ambiguity present because of our value orientation. So can we really realistically multitask these disparate activities of teaching and mentoring and evaluating and screening out students all at the same time? That is a question. But we need to try to do that to the best of our ability. The best we can do, I think, is to recognize our responsibility to struggle honestly with those multi-dimensions, those dueling values that inform being a social worker. And maybe it's just inevitable that our priority of doing more gatekeeping in a more precise way will continue to be loosely dealt with at times, ill-defined, and ethically challenging because we have a strong value orientation in our profession, and thank heavens we do, right? So we still have to, even so, maintain a commitment to persevere through our uncertainty and discomfort with those various values that inform being a social worker while also gatekeeping our profession. Thank you very much. So I think what we want to do is give people time to ask questions, and I'm not saying that I'll necessarily have the answers, but I bet in this room with the wealth of experience we have, we might have a few answers. So if you have a question, please, there is a microphone that you can use to ask.
Yes, my name is Nick Yakovich. I'm a field faculty, and I've been a field supervisor, and I've supervised people who've been field supervisors. And I just wonder, as I was listening, first was the strongest implication seems to be more for the clinical social worker, people who are working with a vulnerable population. And part of what sticks in my head is just the taxonomic structure of the way we're looking at the problem, that it's either you're in or you're out, and that we don't have, I'm wondering, I guess as a question for you, have we explored kind of a remedial probationary, I mean, I know they have extra hours they have to get supervised to get a license, for example, but why it's a, you know, at this point in time we don't think you have the skills, and to me the bigger issue is you're not willing to look at that and do something about it, which is bigger than any limitation. But then why is it a no instead of a not yet, and having something else in place to see if this person can be brought along? Because you could say this for us across the field, across our careers. A competent social worker today could be one of the folks you would want to screen out 5 years from now. So I think that the whole idea is what do we do? Yeah. And is it a yes or no, in or out, and short-term kind of response?
You know, most of the time, that is what we do. Most of the time, we do have remedial measures, and we do extend things, and we do give students second and sometimes third opportunities. My talk is really on whether there should ever be a student who is clearly identified as unsuited, and is it okay for us to screen them out? And so from my point of view, it's uncomfortable, and I don't really want to do it, but I need to do it sometimes. And so I think we could all agree that an egregious issue like, the student slept with the client or the student stole money from the client, maybe everybody in here agrees, okay, let's, screen that student out. But what's much more complicated is when you have a student who doesn't seem to be able to relate to any of the clients, doesn't really like people, won't take your supervision, what did Peggy say, impervious to feedback. And then those are things that in the beginning, we definitely do that. We're like, this is the first semester, let's see how they do the second semester. And then when in the foundation year, we go, well, maybe this is all part of being new, and it's part of the developmental trajectory, and we're just going to wait till the second semester. But by the time we get to the second year, the advanced year, but by the time we get to the advanced year, if we're going through and the student has had difficulty in the first field placement, and they're having difficulty in the second field placement, and especially if they're not related in any way, but they're continuing to have those difficulties, we have to be brave and at least confront those. Your issue about confronting them and trying to address it, that is what we do, but sometimes there are people who don't do that. I mean, there are agency supervisors or field faculty who will say, well, it's a little problem. Yeah, she sort of didn't show up a lot, but but we know she's having a lot of issues, and it's incumbent upon us to talk to the person about that and to show our expectations. Sometimes I'll ask an agency supervisor when I'm the field instructor going out, I'll say to them when they're talking to the student about something they're concerned about, I'll say, would you hire this person? Talk to the student about what you think about this. And sometimes they'll say, well, she has a lot of potential, but she's late every single day, and no, I wouldn't hire her. And even though I know she has potential, but I want her to understand that our standard is something different, so. But of course, you are right, and that is the area that we're very comfortable talking about. Strengths and giving them alternatives and remediating and sort of trying to give them every benefit of the doubt. The part we're not less comfortable talking about is those that really we probably shouldn't be spending so much time with. But I will say that when you have a student who is clearly unsuited, and that we would all agree is unsuited, the behaviors will show themselves over and over again. So they'll come up in different ways. You don't have to worry that you have to figure that out yourself, because it will become very obvious that they're not able to do this, and they're not able to relate to these people, or they violated some ethical thing. And there will not just be one thing, but you will see whatever the etiology is of their difficulties, you will see it play itself out over and over again. Maybe they can't take supervision. Maybe they can't relate to your other workers in your agency. So those are all things that we want to think about. But especially when you're a bachelor's level agency supervisor or you're a first year, we tend to really, want to give the benefit of the doubt to the student, and we should, and we should. So I just want to say that I'm not for screening out lots and lots of students. I think we do a pretty good job. I actually think we do a better job now than we did 10 or 20 years ago. But I do think we need to be able to talk about it and have debates. I think that if we have debates about it and sort of talk about both sides of the issues with that person, it'll become clear. Good question, though.
Hi, I'm Amy Orlin. I'm a field faculty. And I was a manager for a long time and did a lot of hiring. And I would look at some of the students that would come and apply, and I would think, oh my goodness, how'd they ever get through the program? Now I'm a field faculty, and I understand better how that happened. I feel like I have kind of a discrimination problem in that I feel such a strong responsibility to the people that we serve to diversify the social work fabric, and that affects my thinking. And also, I'm very open or aware of the challenges that some of my students come to class with, that they haven't had the support, they don't have the financial means. Maybe they're the first person in their family to ever go to college, and they do need that extra time to develop. But it's kind of yin-yang thing, because I beat myself up thinking, wow, if I was on the other end and hiring somebody who has such significant challenges, is that fair or appropriate? So I'm talking out of both sides of my head.
No, but that's actually good, because I kind of feel that as long as we're talking and as long as we're being brave and looking at both sides of the issue, we're doing what we need to do, because there are no clear answers, really, and reasonable people can disagree. So I think we owe it to the students to give them the feedback of what we're concerned about. It doesn't mean we should screen them out. And I resonate fully with your views about the resilience of our students and the difficulties of the things that our students these days are struggling with. Sometimes we think more than in the past. I don't know. Maybe we just didn't know in the past that people had all these issues. But we certainly had more students who were full-time just doing school 20 or 30 years ago than we do now. I mean, most of our students do not live on campus. They have families, they have full-time work, and we do have we have, at my school, which is a smaller school than your school, we have 30% diversity, which tends to be considered good. But at the same time, then the faculty struggles with, well, what about my expectations for writing? And what about my expectations for being willing to look at yourself and being willing to work with a wide variety of people, some of whom are very ornery or very wounded? And are we being fair to students to throw them into that without sort of preparing them for what's coming? But I congratulate you for the struggle, because that's where I think we need to be, is in the struggle of it. I think somebody else had a question.
Oh, Lori Duraney, Ho-Chunk Behavioral Health. I think part of the problem is that social work is such a broad field. And I have seen students, and I've been doing this for quite a long time, who might be really good at working with developmental disabilities and just rotten with addictions. So part of my job as a field supervisor is to maybe direct them towards the place where their personality and skill set is going to fit best. And it's still social work, but it's just in a different area of social work. Likewise, some people are going to work really well with Native peoples because we have our own way of doing things and our own culture and social strata, whereas, someone else may, I used to work in inner city Pittsburgh. I fit real well there. I did not fit well in a predominantly white urban hospital environment. So there are also different places in social work that people can excel, and field placement, I think, is where they find out.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because that's been one of our saving graces, is that we have so many different aspects to social work. But there is even and I am not advocating one position or another, but there are those people who feel that students or people who are going to be social workers should be able to work with different populations, not only one. And so when you get the student who says, I can't work with men, and I can't work with old people, and I can't work with inmates, but I am happy to work with children. And and then we have to say, well, how do you know those children don't have incarcerated parents? How do you know? I mean, how do you know they're not going to have old people taking care of them, kinship care? So how can you separate that? But your point is well taken, that because we are such a broad profession and we try to do everything for everybody, that a lot of times you can direct a student, or you can recognize that the student may not be as strong in this, but hey, they're really strong in that. And that's one of the things I believe, is that you have to weigh those competencies and meta-competencies. And if they're not the greatest at talking to people, and they're kind of shy, but they have great analytic skills, and they're very conscientious and committed to social justice, there's absolutely no reason they can't be a social worker. That's not a problem at all.
First of all, my name is Barbara Bosted, and I'm on the Professional Consultative Committee. I've also been an agency supervisor and on the field faculty here in the past. And I am struck by, I've been in the field for 37 years, and I am struck by how little we've had this kind of discussion. I am thrilled that you brought this today. I am thrilled that it was part of the agenda. It really drew me. I was planning to be here, but it really drew me because this is a discussion, the dialogue we do not have very often. And it really behooves us to start looking at this because when when students get the degree, it isn't saying, well, you should really work in, because I really appreciate what you're saying. It doesn't say, but this is really just good for, hospital settings, or just really good for, it's good for social work. And in whatever setting the student chooses to become involved in. But having the dialogue and the conversation, and I've actually, over the course of years, have not failed any students, I'm like you, although I have counseled 2 out of going into the field.
Me too.
And that talk about draining psychologically, talk about emotionally but after being in the field for these many years and seeing people in the field who really maybe shouldn't be there, on very few, but seeing a few of those and realizing the impact on clients, it's a whole lot more desirable to get it in the front end than see what damage is done over the course of the many years if they've been practicing. But I really appreciate so much that you brought this to us today.
Thank you so much. That's really why I talk about it, not because I want to screen a lot of students out. And I encourage you to talk in your classes with the students about what they think is a suited social worker and what do they think field agency supervisors want and what do they think would be a problem. Because students know. I mean, students know what kind of social worker they want. And sometimes students will come into the field and say, I decided to be a social worker because my experiences with social workers in the past has been really bad. And I want to be different from the kind of social workers that and I'm always very amazed by that perspective. But I think it speaks to the issue that students view social workers as some good and some not so good. And we do need to explore more what they think, and particularly we need to explore more about what agency supervisors think makes a good social worker. We need to spend more time getting your input into what we should be, not just training them, but whether you agree with my issue of personal attributes, for example, like whether that's something that you prioritize when you're looking at a student.
Hi, Shelley Stouts. So I finished my master's in '99, so I'm trying to think back. You said there was this changeover in like the early '90s, something like that, moving to more of a competency-based type of evaluation system. The reason I bring that up is because when I was going through school, and I don't know if this is still the case, because what I've noticed is now as a supervisor is I do feel to some extent that and I've been a field supervisor in Maryland. I went to University of Maryland, so
me too.
Okay. And so being a field supervisor there and being a field supervisor to different universities, I think overall, I don't know that the evaluation system is ongoing like it used to be when I was an undergrad. I felt I met my very first, I haven't seen her in many, many years. We had to do, what was it, like 40 hours of volunteer in your first or second year. And she evaluated me at that point. Okay, as a freshman, I was 18, 19 years old, probably 19, 20 years old. And I had an evaluation system all the years of college and through my internship. So by the time I got to my field placement, I should already be I don't think that's the place where we should be there. It's just our responsibility to be putting people in and out and moving and deciding then. I think they should already know what their strengths and weaknesses are. But I don't think that that's consistent among all of the people that I've supervised. I think some people had a very strong undergrad program or a very good first year. And other ones, I'm really concerned they had finished their bachelor's degree because they don't seem to even have the basic social skills that they should have as a generalist social worker, let alone in a master's program. So I don't know if other people are saying that. I guess my big point here is I think we need to not just look at that we're evaluating the last year or two. I mean, that to me is a little too late. I think we should be evaluating people's skills and strengths all along. Field instruction should be sort of the end evaluation system. So.
I think that's a great point. And sometimes to just talk about evaluating students or talk about what we expect of students, sometimes audiences will think, that I am, I don't know, anti-student or something. And I've actually got into this because I suffer from the same thing that most of us suffer from, giving the student the benefit of the doubt or possibly enabling students that maybe I shouldn't have been. And so, so I really got interested in looking at this because I really couldn't figure out when I was an early agency supervisor what exactly would constitute not letting a student go through. And something about that seemed wrong to me, especially watching my occupational therapist colleague. But you have a great point, and of course, we like to think that we would do a good job counseling students out before helping them figure out whether this is right for them, and you would always prefer that. Then it's really only the situations where the students have done okay in the volunteer experience, and the students have done pretty well in the classroom, and you really don't, for example, in the baccalaureate program, you really don't see them full-fledged in the field, where some people think some things will surface more than they do in the classroom, until their last year. And so it is difficult, and there's a lot of faculty that will say, like, oh, their bachelor's level, they're only going to be able to do case management, probably the graduate program won't take them in, it's just too much, I'm Jewish, so I say, too much simus for us to sort of even be spending all this time on this, when I first started, I definitely passed in the classroom, in the field, a student or two that later I thought, oh my, if I'd been here longer, had more confidence, been able to clearly articulate what wasn't happening and what was happening, even though we had many meetings with that student or two, that student surely wouldn't have passed through. My only comfort is that those students who had trouble getting through, and we did help them sort of pass through, but they were very aware of what the problems were, the issues, did not go on to practice in social work and did not go on to go to graduate school. Yeah. They're not going to be happy, and also, yeah. And actually, somebody made, yeah. Yeah, and actually, somebody made the point yesterday that we really needed to be doing all this up front, and sort of doing good advising with students, and that a lot of times schools will just say, well, we'll take whoever, and oh, they want to be a social worker, great, you went to community college, that's fine, you took some classes that are very relevant, of course you can be a social worker, go sign up for social work. And we just have been telling our admissions people, that's great, and we want social work students, but please don't tell them that, they're automatically in and they're a social worker, because actually it's not going to totally work that way, and we want them to know up front. I'm sure that in my school, the percentage of students in the first few years we were, I was the field director, that were being screened out was nil, But I will say that I feel much more comfortable, even with the difficulty and the discomfort and the difficulty for the student, which always hurts my heart. I feel much more comfortable with the idea that I'm functioning with integrity and I have not turned a student loose on clients who is surely going to harm them, And our problem isn't so much with the people we know surely are going to harm somebody, but it's more with those people we're not sure about. And the more precise we get in the measures and our definition of suitability, the more clear it'll be to us where is that threshold. But I am totally for erring on the side of caution. And if you think that student might be fine in social work, giving them an opportunity to go on and try further and see how they do.
I have a question. I'm a new field supervisor. Last year I had a student who was difficult, and we had some issues.
We appreciate you so much. We know what you're going to do.
Yeah. Oh, I learned a lot.
Yeah, those are the students
and I really appreciate your bringing this issue to us today. Since my experience and what you're telling me now, I'm thinking that the next time I have a student, what I would like to do, and which we weren't advised to do, last year, at least in our training, was to ask the faculty supervisor if they know of any past history with this student. Would I be breaching confidentiality with that question?
That's a great question. Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. A whole nother talk. But one thing I would say is you might be. If the student hasn't given permission to share certain things about their history, then we have to be very circumspect about what we share. But you should call on the agency, should call on the field faculty to come out, not the normal amount of time that they're coming out, but much more often, and deal with the burden of this with someone else besides just yourself, because it's hard, and it's hard on us to have to be confrontational with a student or disappoint a student, and we should have extra support in doing that. But also the field instructor will be able to shed a different perspective and will be able to articulate various competencies that sometimes we as agency supervisors, kind of know in a way, but we may not articulate it the way they're being taught in the classroom, and will be a support to you. And that should be the field instructor's role, I think. But I do come from the perspective of being an agency supervisor, so I tend to probably assume that the agency supervisor is really putting a lot of energy and really trying, and that it's very rare for an agency supervisor to just dismiss a student out of hand, where I might have to really advocate for the student or give them a different placement. That most of the time, the agency supervisors are working really, really hard to try to help the student. And I think we should, but we can take that role of being hey, here's the bottom line of what you must achieve, and take that a little bit away from the agency supervisor, who has developed a very close rapport with the student, serves a certain function with the student that makes it particularly difficult. But as far as sharing information, I've had students who have failed a placement, and I'm going to place them in another placement. And I don't believe that I really have the right to share with the field instructor that they failed another placement. But you can trust that I've given a lot of time and thought to what the student needs to do to demonstrate that they're ready to go in, and they've done it. And that I've thought a lot about which agency and which field instructor, we have different lingo where on the East Coast, the agency supervisor, what agency supervisor might be best to help that student. If we've decided to give that student a second chance, then which we most of the time do, maybe I'm almost 100% of the time. I mean, I can think of one student where and a couple students we counseled out where it was just, you're not going into social work, but most of the time the student, even if they have been dismissed for failing the drug test or having going to the field with substance issues and various symptoms of mental health issues, would always be given another chance, but they would have to give us certain clearances and demonstrate that they understand what happened in the first placement before we replace them. So I would probably say to the agency supervisor, this is what this student needs. She needs some professionalizing. She needs this. She's got really good skills in this, but she needs a little more experience at that. But I would not say she failed the placement last year, because then I think that, first of all, the student would feel that I'm preventing her possibility of having success in the second placement, and then there would be the issue of confidentiality about what occurred. And same with disabilities, they ask, will you tell the field, the agency supervisor, that the student has some personal things in their background? I won't unless the student has told me that they're already talking to the person about it, and I encourage students to share it and say that, they'll be much more able to help you if you tell them that this thing might be an issue for you, and they can tell you what they're expecting, and they can tell you how they can help you. But still, there are students who won't share or go for accommodations to the disabilities office. So I have to watch the time because there's other things. I'm going to stay around, though. I know you're going to meet in small groups, and if you have more questions, I'll kind of be puttering around when you're doing your small groups, please call me over and ask me. Not that I have the answers necessarily, but I'd love to dialogue and reflect with you about it. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would just add that our great appreciation for, I think what the message I take away is we need to have more of a dialogue around this. And I was thinking about our evaluations, and as you know, the competencies are something that came out in 2008 with the Council of Social Work Education's standards and policies, and they're a given. We need to use those. But maybe we're not doing enough in identifying what Dr. Sowbel talked about as those meta competencies, those areas that can be gray. And perhaps the challenge to the next field director, I can certainly start working on it myself with your help, and I have to emphasize your help, is looking at, is there a tool or is there something we could use that will help to help us, provide some guidance to those other types of behaviors that clearly we need to be considering as well. And just the communication, keeping that dialogue and communication open. Speaking of that, I said this last year, I'll say this again, early recognition. Somebody mentioned, contacting the field faculty if they're beginning to see something that is troubling to them about the student. Call or contact that field faculty. That is valuable information for us to have, and it will begin that dialogue then. Early recognition allows for then early intervention, and we appreciate that.